Wow, this excerpt we're diving into today, it's an opinion piece. And it has some really strong opinions from President Zelenskyy about the Russian people.
It does, yeah. You can really feel that, the weight of what he's going through as a wartime leader in his words.
So for this deep dive, we're really going to try to understand Zelenskyy's perspective, like how he's viewing this situation and how the author of this piece frames it. And one of the things that stood out to me right away was Zelenskyy's statement about not respecting the Russian people. He says he doesn't respect them because they didn't stop the war, even though he appealed to them in Russian.
That's a heavy statement to make, especially from a leader in his position, right? You can definitely feel the frustration, the disillusionment.
Yeah, it's like he's saying that they were just bystanders, like they didn't take action when Ukraine needed them.
And he uses, he tries to illustrate this point with some interesting examples. He talks about asking a robber to put down their gun while they're robbing a house, or asking, rapists to reconsider in the middle of it.
And it's like the author picks up on that and uses sarcasm to point out how unrealistic Zelenskyy's expectations are. They talk about Hitler invading Poland or Napoleon invading Russia and point out that simply appealing to the aggressor's people didn't exactly stop those conflicts either.
And I think what they're trying to show here is just how complex war really is and how limited individual action can be in those situations. It's not as simple as, asking and then having things change, especially when you're dealing with an authoritarian regime.
The author also brings up a really interesting fact that over 20,000 Russians were detained for protesting the war.
Which really makes you stop and think, because it directly counters Zelenskyy's statement, It forces us to acknowledge that there were Russians who actively opposed this war, and they faced very real consequences for it.
So it's almost like the author is saying that Zelenskyy is overlooking or maybe even downplaying the sacrifices of those Russians who did speak out.
Exactly. And they even go so far as to use a pretty loaded term to describe Zelenskyy's position: woke victimism.
Woke victimism. What do they mean by that?
Well, the way the author uses the term here, it seems like they're suggesting that Zelenskyy is demanding action from others, almost like they owe him something, He's essentially saying, you should have done this for me because it was the right thing to do. At least that's how the author interprets it.
That's an interesting take. And then they take it even further and compare Zelenskyy to Gilderoy Lockhart from the Harry Potter books.
It's a pretty bold comparison, right? But I think it drives home their point, It's like they're implying that Zelenskyy might be a bit too focused on his own actions and pronouncements, maybe not focused enough on the bigger strategic picture of the war, similar to how Lockhart cares more about his image than actually dealing with threats.
It's a pretty sharp critique.
It is. And then they go on to contrast Zelenskyy's efforts with, organizing meetings, telethons, things like that, with the sacrifices that Ukrainian soldiers are making, actually fighting and dying on the front lines.
So they're suggesting that Zelenskyy's focus on individual actions might be taking away from what needs to be done to actually combat the invasion, the military strategies and actions.
It seems that way, yeah. Connecting it back to the bigger picture. Maybe they're questioning his leadership, suggesting his focus on these individual things is overshadowing what needs to happen to win the war.
And then there's the author's final point, which is, a bit of a head scratcher. They claim that Zelenskyy seems to be expecting others to solve this whole situation for him. First, it was the Russian people, and then, strangely enough, former President Trump.
It's a really thought-provoking point they make, because it suggests like a pattern in his approach, right? A reliance on these external forces to somehow fix things instead of focusing solely on what he and Ukraine can control.
So where does that leave us? We have Zelenskyy's very raw emotional response to feeling let down by the Russian people. And then we have this author's kind of analytical critique of his stance.
It raises some really big questions about Zelenskyy's view of, individual responsibility versus collective action, especially during war. He's clearly angry, frustrated with what he sees as inaction from the Russian people. But the author pushes back, saying, hold on, it's complicated to expect individuals to rise up against an authoritarian regime. Real change usually needs a much broader approach.
Definitely a lot to think about.
A lot to unpack, yeah. And it's a conversation worth having, that's for sure. War is never black and white, and understanding everyone's perspectives, even if we don't agree with them, is really important for navigating these situations. It's true, Zelenskyy is under immense pressure leading a nation during wartime. It's got to be an unimaginable burden.
Yeah.
And his perspective, it's definitely colored by all the trauma he's seeing.
I get that, but the author doesn't seem to think that excuses some of his statements. especially when it comes to those Russians who actually did speak out against the war, even though, they were risking a lot by doing so.
That's a big issue for the author, yeah. They acknowledge that, okay, a lot of Russians support Putin in the war, but they're pushing back against this idea that Zelenskyy seems to have about all Russians being complicit. They're saying, hey, look, there were people who resisted, who actively fought against this, and they paid the price for it.
And they have that really powerful story about Olesya Krivtsova, the 19-year-old student who got threatened with a sledgehammer just for protesting.
It's such a stark reminder, about how much courage it takes to dissent in Russia and what the cost can be. The author uses that example to directly challenge Zelenskyy's whole thing about Russians being mute during the invasion.
So on one hand, we have Zelenskyy speaking from this place of intense personal experience, trying to lead his country through this awful war. But the author's saying, hold on, there's more to it than that. You're not seeing the whole picture.
Exactly. They're really pushing for a more balanced view of what's going on in Russia. It's dangerous to just lump everyone together, especially when you have people like Krivtsova who are proof that there's resistance.
It makes you think, how much can we really expect from people living under an authoritarian regime? It's easy to say they should just rise up, but that's a lot easier said than done.
That's a good point. You have to consider what they're up against, the risks involved in speaking out. It's not something everyone can do or has the resources to handle.
The author seems to be saying that Zelenskyy's idea of just asking the Russian people to overthrow their government is kind of naive. Like it's oversimplifying a very messy situation.
Yeah, they're pushing back against that whole idea that it's all on the Russian people to fix this. Real change, the kind that lasts, usually needs both internal pressure and help from the outside. It's complicated.
This whole conversation just shows how hard it is to understand what it's like to be in Zelenskyy's shoes. He's under so much pressure, dealing with so much trauma. Of course, that's going to affect how he sees things.
Of course. His words are coming from a place of living through this attack, facing these threats constantly, seeing his people suffer. You can't just ignore that.
But like the author says, that doesn't mean he can just disregard the people who did put themselves on the line to oppose the war.
It's a tough balance to strike. We need to be empathetic to what Zelensky's going through, but we also need to think critically about what he's saying. We can't just accept everything at face value.
I'm really starting to see how complicated this whole thing is. It's not as simple as good guys versus bad guys.
Exactly. War is messy, it's full of trauma, and there are so many layers to it. If we really want to get it, to figure out a way forward, we have to be open to all sides, even the ones we disagree with. We have to be empathetic, but also critical thinkers.
Okay, so what else does the author have to say? I'm ready for the rest of their argument. It feels like the author's saying there's this disconnect between Zelenskyy talking about individual action and what's actually happening with the Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the front lines.
Yeah, it seems like they're implying that Zelenskyy, maybe without realizing it, is putting more focus on being this global figurehead than on what it takes to win the war, the actual strategy. They talk about how he's organizing meetings and doing telethons and stuff, but then they contrast that with the soldiers who are out there risking their lives, dying.
It makes you think about the pressure he must feel. He has to be a wartime leader, but also this international figure, a symbol of resilience. It's a lot to be at once.
Right. And is it even possible to do all of that at the same time? I don't know. It just shows how tough it is to be in that position, to lead during a war. There are so many expectations on you.
And then there's that part where the author says Zelenskyy is basically waiting for someone else to fix everything. First, he's looking to the Russian people. And then this is the weird part. He turned to former President Trump.
That's where things get really interesting. It seems like they're pointing out a pattern in how Zelenskyy handles things, like he's relying on outside forces instead of focusing on what he can actually control in Ukraine. The question is, are they right about that, or is it more complicated?
This whole deep dive has really made me think about how individual responsibility and collective action play out during a war. It's clear Zelenskyy is angry and disappointed in the Russian people, but the author's arguing that it's not fair to just expect them to overthrow their government. Like, it's not that easy.
Absolutely. It's a really complex situation, and you have to look at it from all sides to even begin to understand what everyone's doing and why.
So at the end of all this, what do you hope our listener will take away?
I think the big question to think about is how Zelenskyy's experiences in this war, all the responsibility on his shoulders, how that's affecting his views. Like, is he disillusioned with the Russian people because of all the stress and trauma he's going through? Or is there something more to it?
That's a great point. It reminds us that even in a huge conflict like this, it all comes down to people. We need to try to understand where everyone's coming from, even if we disagree with them.
Right. We have to be empathetic and think critically at the same time. That's how we learn, how we grow, and maybe, just maybe, how we figure out how to have a more peaceful world.